And so the name of the webinar series is Flipping the Script, because the pro-abortion narrative that is very dominant in government and in media and even in industry is something that we need to flip. We need to be able to break through with facts and data. And that's really why I felt called to start speaking publicly about this last July. I was very nervous about doing it. I was told by people that it would be career suicide. I had even pro-life people telling me, don't do it. You're better off in the academy being a voice there. But I really did feel the call very deeply in my heart to do this. And so, I'm very grateful for all of you to be the early movers. I kind of feel like the people on this webinar right now, we're the start of a new generation, because in many ways we've hit rock bottom in our country in terms of our abortion law. We really can't get any worse on abortion. We have abortion up to birth and on demand. We can start killing children after birth indiscriminately as well, but we're not at that point yet. At this point, we are at the most radical we could be on our abortion laws, in that it's available for any reason. So we really do need to flip that script, and I think the people in this room here tonight are the people that are going to help do that. So I thank you very much for that, for being here. So let's have a chat about this Senate report. So I had high hopes for this Senate report, having gone down to Canberra and having participated in Senate inquiries over the last 15 years as an academic, many Senate inquiries on the issue of migration and labour, which is the area that I research in at the university. So like a number of pro-life groups, I went down in June for a day of oral hearing, and the way they kind of structured it was the morning were the pro-life groups and the afternoon were the people that were pro-abortion and opposed the bill. And this is the timeline of what happened. So the bill was introduced by Matt Canavan into the parliament last year in November. It was supported by Alex Antic and Ralph Babette. It was a private member's bill. So that means it's not a government bill, it's not a Labor Party bill or a Liberal Party bill, but it was an individual bill supported by private members. But that's often the way reform has taken place in our country. So in New South Wales, for example, when abortion up to birth was introduced in 2019, that was a private members bill. Alex Greenwich and members from the Labor Party, such as Joe Halen, who sponsored the bill, and that was how it took place. So just because it's a private members bill doesn't mean it can't attract majority support. The Senate then referred the bill to an inquiry, and I think that was fantastic that we had that opportunity, because prior to this, George Christensen, who's no longer an MP, he'd introduced a very similar bill in the previous parliament, but permission for an inquiry hadn't been granted. And as a result, it meant there was no debate on the bill and no investigation on the bill. So I think that is something that the Labor government did allow. They allowed the Senate inquiry to take place. There was then a call for submissions. There was that day of oral hearings in June. And I actually think that we presented such compelling evidence in June that the committee knew that they probably couldn't just whitewash it, and it wasn't a slam dunk like they'd hoped. And so then they applied for an extension of time and they got it, which is why the report was handed down on the 31st of August. So just last Thursday. So this really is the first Australian kind of webinar breaking open the issue. It was these 6 women who had the power to write this report. And on the edge of the screen, you'll see Senator Marielle Smith, who was the chair of the committee. So she's actually from my home state of South Australia. To the oral hearing, it was very interesting. Only Senator Marielle Smith and Senator Anne Urquhart from Labor bothered to turn up. The other 4 women who sit on this committee did not even dial in or turn up for the hearing. Senator Alex Antic and Senator Matt Canavan were present. Senator Ralph Babette was overseas, so he was unable to attend. But, it's really interesting that there were 6 women who I understand you get paid more for sitting on a parliamentary inquiry and being on a committee, and yet 4 of them didn't even bother to turn up for the evidence, which is quite disappointing. The submissions. So we've had 2 Senate inquiries into abortion this year, and I've seen the same thing happen for both inquiries. So the first inquiry was the universal access to reproductive healthcare inquiry that Larissa Waters from the Greens was really pushing. And in that inquiry, we saw thousands of submissions that were made by pro-life Australians that were just buried and not published on the website. It seemed to be the case that all the pro-abortion submissions were published, but the pro-life submissions just weren't there. And the committee said that they all covered similar themes, so they were going to just sort of summarise them and put them in there. But as a result, in that first inquiry, we could see that there was a real suppression of voices. The same thing appears to have happened this time. The committee published 154 submissions, but in the report it says the inquiry received a large volume of material associated with campaigns outlined in Appendix 2. Samples of each coordinated campaign and form letter have been published on the committee's website. So if you go to the committee's website and Appendix 2, what you see is that what they've said is there were people that wrote to this inquiry because of ACL, because of the Canberra Declaration, and because of Professor Joanna Howe. So they said these are the three sort of campaigns that were being run, and people wrote in because of those three campaigns. But I know for a fact that there were Australians. I've had Australians email me their submission. They had nothing to do with me, ACL, or Canberra Dec. They researched it independently themselves, and their submission was unpublished on the website. So I think it's really clear that there is an agenda to not allow the Australian people, or not allow transparency about the fact that the numbers really are on our side, and particularly with this issue of children born alive after an abortion. The numbers are overwhelmingly on our side, and I think the committee really didn't want that getting out, and as a result the submissions are not there, and I think that is a grave injustice to the people that spent time to write submissions, and it's a real indictment on democracy. So that's something I'm calling out on social media. I'm also writing to the senators and making it very clear that that's not acceptable in a democracy. So if we look at the report, what I'm going to do now is summarise what I think are kind of the main lies or falsehoods in the report. And I know I'm a lawyer, and I know that the word lie cannot be used lightly, but I have deliberately used it here because I do think that the Senate report that was produced does mislead the Australian people and does misrepresent what is the truth. So in the report, they go through what they consider to be the objections to this bill. And so this whole inquiry is about the Human Rights Children Born Alive Protection Bill that Matt Canavan introduced. And the inquiry is to look at, is this a good bill? Should it be amended? What are the merits and disadvantages of this bill? And so the first thing that the committee does is they look at, is this bill constitutional? And essentially what they say is that giving newborns a federal right to care is illegal and unconstitutional. What they say is that health is a provision for state governments, and it's state governments and territory governments that determine legislation in regards to abortion. And so they say it's unconstitutional because the federal government doesn't have power to make laws about abortion. Now, Matt Canavan obviously thought about this issue when he introduced his bill. And there's something in the Constitution called the external affairs power. So this is something, if you studied law, or maybe you've watched The Castle or some of the other movies that are out there that show Australian law, you'll understand that the external affairs power is Section 5135. And what it is if there's an overseas treaty that Australia has ratified, so we've signed up to an overseas convention or treaty, that then becomes something that through the external affairs power we can implement through the federal government through legislation. So if I move to my next slide, what you'll see is the external affairs power in the Constitution allows the government to make national laws which implement the convention. And Matt Canavan, in introducing this bill, he said, I'm implementing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 1 and Article 6 in particular provide protection for all children who have been born in a nation state. And so what you can see is, because there is an international convention that we were one of the first signatories to, there actually is the power for the government to introduce a national law that protects newborns. But let me tell you what the committee quoted, because what you'll see if you read the report, and I'll send a link to it tomorrow, they've said that Matt Canavan has misinterpreted Australia's international human rights obligations. Now, they haven't provided any evidence for this except for the quotes from abortion lobbyists. So, for example, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, which is essentially a pro-abortion activist group, the bill fundamentally misunderstands the normative context of the obligations it purports to give effect to, and it ignores the jurisprudence with respect to these obligations. So, in plain English, what this activist lobby group is saying is that Matt Canavan, in introducing this bill, it's not introducing it according to the spirit and intention of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. what this group is trying to say is that there's all this pro-abortion case law and, discussion at an international level. And yet this bill by Matt Canavan is kind of more of a pro-life bill, and thus it goes against that. But, they don't quote any case law. And I've had a look at this, and I can't find jurisprudence on Article 1 or Article 6 which supports their proposition. And so I actually think like it's really weak of the committee to have said that this is unconstitutional, but to not have provided any examples of how this convention has been interpreted in international law. And so then the report goes on to quote an abortion lobbyist, Children by Choice, and they say, Children by Choice says that the bill relies on a disingenuous use of the convention, and this is at the discretion of state, not federal legislation. So again, they're using a lobbyist to create the evidence for their position that the bill is unconstitutional. Now, as a university professor, if a student did that, like if a student made an argument and then just found people that agreed with that student's argument, like activist organizations, that is not good evidence. I mean, if they're arguing that this is unconstitutional because it misinterprets the convention, they should be providing some examples of case law and international decisions, and they just don't do that. So that to me is a really concerning issue in the report, that they've just said it's unconstitutional. And just quickly, like I know law is not everybody's strong point, but I just wanted to offer an insight from another example. In my other area of research. So industrial relations, labour law, it was always governed by the states and territories. But through the Keating government in 1993, they used the external affairs power because they got an international convention on termination of employment, and they used that to create national IR law. That was then continued by John Howard. So, I mean, we have precedent in many other areas, such as industrial relations and work choices, where we've had national legislation and it's been introduced through the external affairs power. So there's absolutely, in my view as a lawyer, there is nothing about this bill that is unconstitutional. And what they provided in the Senate report really doesn't do anything to substantiate their position that it is. So then the next thing that they do, the next lie, which I feel this is the lie that probably irks me the most in the whole report, they say that babies born alive after an abortion almost never happens, and that late-term abortions are very rare. And so hopefully if you've been following my content on social media, you know what the facts are, but I think it's really important to go through them here. So this is actually what they quote in the report. And again, when they said late-term abortions are rare, they're quoting abortion lobbyists. And so this quote here, termination of pregnancies past 20 weeks gestation comprise about 1% of pregnancy terminations, and they're due to later diagnosed major structural issues, genetic syndrome, severe fetal growth restriction, or maternal conditions where pregnancy continuation would be significantly detrimental to the mental or physical health of the mother. Okay, so what they're essentially saying is late-term abortion is really rare. Babies born alive after late-term abortion is even rarer. Just want to say that this is something you hear all around the world in terms of pro-abortion activists. And there's a debate in the US going on about this very issue. The thing is, when there's 88,000 abortions every year in Australia, 1% is actually not a small amount, is it? It's a significant amount. And we can see from the data that that in Victoria and Queensland, for example, there's been 4,929 late-term abortions since 2010. So that's nearly 5,000 children who were gestationally viable in 2 states. In those states, those children could have been induced alive and given care. The other thing, instead of being killed first through an injection and then being born dead. Now, the other thing this quote says is that it's always because there's a severe issue. And what they're trying to point out is that the child probably wouldn't live after birth. But again, the data doesn't show that. 44% of late-term abortions are actually on physically healthy babies with physically healthy mothers. They're for a psychosocial reason. People often ask me, what does psychosocial mean? Well, it's a broad term. It's like a catch-all term that pertains to anything to do with a mother's well-being or health. So it could be job loss, it could be relationship breakdown, it could be anxiety, depression. It can really be anything that affects a mother's well-being. And so it's a very broad reason. And in 2011 in Victoria, a child at 37 weeks gestation who was physically healthy was killed through a late-term abortion. Now, that is, I talk about that one a lot because I had a child born at 37 weeks at Flinders, and, holding him after his birth, it's just so obvious that it's a human being with human rights. And yet this is what our law actually allows. So it's really important to get this data out there and to talk about it in this concrete kind of way. Nearly 5,000 children between 2010 and 2020 in just 2 states have had their lives ended through late-term abortion. We added New South Wales in. We would have, and other states, this would be a much, much bigger number. So, it's really disgusting of the committee to not have acknowledged this. Okay, the next lie is that babies born alive after an abortion aren't really alive. And we saw this in the submissions. We also heard it in the oral evidence. And this is Patricia Moore. She's an academic, an abortion activist, devoted her life to pro-abortion, to a pro-abortion agenda. She says a sign of life may include limb movement or pulsation. So what she's really saying there is a child will they'll exit the birth canal, but they're not really alive. They just might move a touch, but it's really not a live baby. Now, we saw this from the government of Victoria when they presented their submission. They said the same thing. They said a child born alive will survive for a matter of moments. So they're really trying to downplay the significance of it. But I made it very clear in my evidence in June what the truth was on this, and I put in very clearly this Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology study. And I presented that orally to the committee, and then afterwards the committee secretariat emailed me and said, can you provide a full reference to that study? And I sent it to them, and I sent them the link so they could actually see it. So I know that the senators were aware of this study. I mean, I said it to Mariel Smith's face and Anne Urquhart's face. They know about this study. And it's a peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And so what that means is when it's peer-reviewed, it means that some academics have done a study, an empirical study, and then it's gone out to blind review, to reviewers who don't know the academics. And so it's a really reputable thing that this study is. And it's just mind-boggling to me that instead of reporting on this study, the senators reported this quote by Patricia Moore. And they did other quotes by abortion activists. They didn't bother reporting the academic evidence. They just reported the quotes by abortion lobbyists. Now, this study looked at 241 babies after 20 weeks. So that's very much on the threshold of viability. We've had children survive internationally at 21 weeks. Obviously, they need a lot of medical care at that point, but that is sort of where viability is pushing to. There were 241 late-term abortions. Feticide wasn't given prior. Now, feticide is when an injection is made into the child in utero to kill them. And so there's different types and methods of feticide. There's potassium chloride or digoxin. Either way, the child, experiences perhaps a cardiac arrest, and then they pass. And so, you can imagine that of that child who's safely in the mother's uterus and just there. The mother's womb, just there waiting, to be born and growing. And then all of a sudden there's this injection that induces a heart attack in that child. And you can imagine what that would be like, that shock and the pain. And there is there's an academic study that shows that there probably is some pain experienced at that point of feticide. Anyway, in this study of 241 children, over half the children survived. So half the babies were born alive. They survived for an average of 32 minutes. So it's not just a limb pulsation or a matter of moments. It's 32 minutes on average. But one child in that study survived for 4 hours for 267 minutes. So that's really significant. If you're thinking about a situation in our country where there isn't a right to care, the only jurisdiction that has that properly is South Australia. New South Wales as well has a different form of that obligation. But in other places, like Queensland, for example, where in the termination of pregnancy guidelines there, it says do not provide life-sustaining treatment. And then it says wrap the child, but there's nothing else. There's nothing else about sort of, picking the child up for emotional comfort. There's nothing about moisture to the child or just comforting that child in any way, anything to ease the pain. So, think about a child for 4 hours in that predicament, or even for 32 minutes. I mean, that's pretty horrific. So it's really disgusting that this was not in the report because they knew about this study. I presented it with them. It's a reputable study. And tellingly, none of the pro-abortion activists who gave submissions on the other side, they didn't attack this study because they couldn't. And in fact, they didn't attack the data at all because it's very difficult for them to do that. Okay, the next lie. So they said that guidelines exist which already protect children born alive after an abortion. And on the screen there, I've got Senator Marielle Smith, who chaired this committee. And she wrote in this report, health practitioners are duty bound to provide care to an infant showing signs of life. And actually very early on in the report at 1.5, they say in most states and territories, clinical practice guidelines direct the medical care provided in the rare instance the signs of life are shown following pregnancy termination. So what they're saying is in the states and territories, there's already guidelines that mandate this. And then they give only one example, which is the Queensland Termination of Pregnancy Guidelines, which I've just talked about, which are an appalling set of guidelines. So the fact that Senator Marielle Smith in her report highlights the Queensland guidelines as emblematic of the status quo, something that is already occurring, that's actually pretty appalling, because I think if Australians knew what was in those guidelines, they would be horrified. I think they'd be horrified to know that a live birth can occur. They would also be horrified to know that it says do not provide life-sustaining treatment and that there's not a right to palliative care or comfort care in those guidelines. So this statement in the report, health practitioners are duty-bound to provide care, again, it was something that was asserted by the abortion activists, by the abortion lobby, but it wasn't substantiated. It's not like they copied and pasted extracts from all the guidelines and put them in there. In fact, the only guideline that's referred to is Queensland. And so, we have to take this at face value, and I certainly don't, given the other untruths in the report. So Julie Hamblin, another abortion activist who featured very prominently in the Senate report. So what's really interesting is they really foregrounded abortion activists and the abortion lobby in the report. And when they wanted to represent the side against abortion or the side supportive of the bill, because you don't even have to be against abortion to support this bill, because the abortion has already happened. So pro-choice people can definitely get behind this bill. But it's really interesting. They didn't quote myself or Johnny Sacker, another academic. They wanted to foreground that this was a Christian issue. Like they wanted to badge it as it's only Christians that care about this bill. So they highlighted the evidence, very scantily, because they really didn't represent our side very well. But they had some quotes from Family Voice and some quotes from ACL, but none of the academic evidence. I think they just didn't want to give any credibility to the side in support of the bill. So Julie Hamblin, pro-abortion activist, and so she says, and a big quote from her in the report, we don't have legislation that mandates palliative care for people dying of cancer. We don't have legislation that mandates pain relief after open heart surgery. The notion that you would have legislation in that particular circumstance when we don't legislate in any other area of medical practice is quite exceptional. And so then this is published in the report as if it's, a really strong example of why we don't need the bill. But it's just, I just actually can't believe they didn't even see the holes in it. Like, it's such a ridiculous thing. So she's saying we don't need to mandate palliative care for open heart surgery and people dying of cancer, but we weren't trying to kill those people, were we, Julie Hamblin? With open heart surgery, we've done surgery to try and save that person. With a person dying of cancer, they're seen as a person under the law, and we're trying to ameliorate their pain. But with an abortion, it's completely different, isn't it? You have a child who was intended to be killed by the abortion, who was born alive. And so at that point, when the child is born alive, she's presented with the very people who are in front of her, the people who tried to kill her and didn't succeed. And so that's why you need a legislative duty that obligates care to be given to that child. It's very, very different. Like, you cannot compare people dying of cancer with children that have survived abortion. It's like apples and oranges. And so, again, at this point, when I got to this point on Thursday reading this quote, I just wanted to tear the whole thing up. I was so angry that, they can just put these abortion activists in there and pretend that this is a fact and it makes sense when it actually doesn't. And so, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I really want to put a spotlight on these people and hold them to account for what they're doing. Okay, so, they said, what was the lie? Let's just go back. What's the lie? Guidelines exist which already protect children. Now, if that was the case, everybody, well, then why do we have these three examples? We've got the two coroner's reports, one for Jessica Jane, left on a metal kidney dish for 80 minutes, wrapped in a blanket in an empty room. Nurse checked on her every 15 minutes, but, she wasn't even held. Like, you can just imagine little Jessica lying there, and she'd been safe in her mother's womb. She was healthy. Like, she was aborted for a psychosocial reason. And the mother probably, what the coroner's report sort of shows is she probably misled the doctor about how advanced she was, or maybe she didn't know. So the doctor didn't give feticide to the child. He assumed that the child, through the trauma of the birth process, would die, but then the child was born alive. So we know that the guidelines in Jessica Jane's case failed her. And in fact, the coroner in that report, and I've spoken to Greg Kavanagh on the phone, he was the coroner in that report, he has, he says in that report that they should introduce guidelines, but they obviously didn't exist at the time. And from my understanding is they don't exist in the Northern Territory at present. The Westmead baby, now this was given to me by a whistleblower. This is a report that was Chambers only, so it wasn't published publicly. That child was born alive. They had a heart defect, and the child was held by the parents for an hour. But then after that, custody over the child just got lost, and the child ended up in a bin while still breathing and alive. And the coroner, Janet Stevenson, says in that case that there was a total abrogation of responsibility for the people who were meant to be looking after that child, like the doctors and the nurses. They didn't do it, and she was found in the bin. And so it was in the wee hours of the morning that she was found and taken to the mortuary, where I think she eventually passed. But, that's just a horrific case. And so I've been reporting on these for a while now, like through the Jessica Jane one and the Westmead baby, through social media. I've reached about 1 million people with videos on those two stories. But a lot of the comments say, well, this doesn't happen anymore. You're talking about two babies. This happened in 1998. But then at the start of this month, I found a newspaper article, which was not about the issue of babies born alive. It was about a mother who had been, according to the Korean Mail, let down by the system. But the very start of that article, the first 3 paragraphs refer to baby Xantha. And they say that in 2020, baby Xantha was born alive. Her parents had gone in for the abortion because she had Down syndrome. She was 19 weeks. When she was born alive, the parents were not informed. She was put in an empty room to die, and she lay there for 7 minutes. So again, with baby Xantha, no one picked her up or held her. And her parents only found out that she was alive through a casual remark by a staff member. And the mother then spiraled downwards and has had, tremendous mental health effects, suicidal ideation and attempts. And, that's what the article was really about. But for me, the article also talked of little Xantha left alone in a room to die. And so, I think we can see really clearly then that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The abortion industry has a vested interest to not let this get out. That is something really clear, that the abortion, we saw this in the committee hearings. The abortion lobby wants to pretend this is a non-issue, and they just don't want these stories to get out. So when we have a story like this, like baby Xantha, in less than 3 years ago, then we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I won't break anyone's confidence, but I've had a number of nurses and doctors reach out to me, and midwives, who have talked about this situation and who say how stressful it is, and how, they're left holding the baby because they don't want to leave the baby in the medical waste room, in the slop room. So they hold the baby while doing their other duties. I mean, this is just horrific that this happens. So the committee decided that the bill would mandate resuscitation, and therefore it would be counterproductive. And so again, they quoted an abortion lobbyist, the Australian Women's Health Network. They said, if the bill passes, it will prevent palliative care post-birth. Now, again, I addressed this head on in my oral evidence, and I made it very clear that the bill did not prevent palliative care and it didn't mandate resuscitation. And I pointed to the senators the actual provision in the bill. So this is where I'm going to conclude. The Human Rights Children Born Alive Protection Bill, it states, the duty owed by a health practitioner to provide medical care to a child born alive is no different than the duty owed to provide medical care to a child born alive other than as a result of termination. So to take that legal jargon and just to explain it, essentially it's an equal treatment provision. They're saying you've got children who are wanted, who weren't aborted, you've got a duty to take care of them when they're born. Similarly, if a child has survived an abortion, you've got the same duty for these two categories of persons. So that's why I've been talking about this as a simple matter of birth equality. And that is the evidence I gave to the senators. And yet in the report, they regurgitate the scare campaign, the propaganda by the abortion lobby, that this bill would prevent palliative care. And I just feel like this is such a disingenuous ploy by the abortion lobby to say, oh, we suddenly care about these babies. They wouldn't get palliative care if this bill passed. It's actually not true. The obligation is exactly the same. So let's imagine I get pregnant with my sixth child, and I, much to everybody's shock, and I would love that. But anyway, have to convince my husband. So imagine that I get pregnant with the sixth child, and unfortunately, there's something wrong, and the child is induced early at like 22, 23 weeks. Okay, and so at that point, we had a child that I very much wanted. And what they would do is they would make a clinical assessment at birth as to what is the best care for that child. Now, if the child had a life-threatening abnormality and just wasn't going to survive, and that was the best judgment they could give, we would give palliative care to that child, and we would wrap that child in a blanket, bit of moisture on the lips. I would hold the child until that child passed. There's no way that child would be left in an empty room, abandoned. And so, but if at 22, 23 weeks that child had nothing wrong with them, like no life-threatening abnormality, and they potentially could survive with medical care, the clinical assessment would then rush them down to the neonates ward, to ICU, and that child would then receive the best possible care in order for that child to then survive. So that's actually what all we're asking for a child that survived an abortion. If a child has survived an abortion, a clinical assessment should be made as to what are the prospects for that child, and then that child should be given care and life-sustaining treatment and then adopted out. But if the child's not going to survive, then palliative care should be given and the emotional needs of that child should be met. And so, I finished with the question, how could anyone be against this? How could any Australian be against giving care to a baby born in Australia? The other side says this already happens through the guidelines. So what is the problem with a legal obligation? And, I've been tossing and turning since last Thursday. And I've had a lot of people have reached out to me to say, keep going, Jo, because I think you could probably tell I was incredibly disheartened and disappointed with the senators, particularly Senator Marielle Smith. Her maiden speech, and I'm going to put that out on socials in a few days, her maiden speech talks about her love of children and her desire to protect Australian children. And yet she had this one opportunity to lead a Senate committee, and this is what she did. This is the report that she wrote. And I know that, I've met her, and I think, how could she have done this? I think obviously the abortion lobby has a lot of money and power, and they donate to political parties. And, Emily's list in the Labor Party is very pro-abortion. That's the thing that they are. And so there's lots of pressure being put on people like Marielle and the other senators. But I think if you're a politician and you're standing up in the Senate and you represent the Australian people, then you have to put all of those interests aside and you have to look at the facts. And I really think in this case, the facts were covered up. And so while initially I felt really disheartened because I just assumed, and speaking out in social media over a year now, I thought I'm just going to tell people the facts and everybody's going to have their eyes open, because that's actually what happened to me. I was pro-choice and it was through someone challenging me and then I investigating the facts. Then I changed my mind. I assumed that would happen. I can see on social media it's a slow process and there are people who are changing their minds. But I assumed even more that by going down to the Senate in June, that I would be able to present that evidence and this committee would properly hear it, because all of the other Senate inquiries I've been involved in, my work has been throughout those reports, it's my research has definitely been acknowledged and highlighted actually. And so I just, to see the stark contrast in this area, to me really exposes how much we need to do as a movement to force these politicians to do the right things.